Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. In the spring of 1667, a spectacular figure arrived in London for the social season, capturing the imagination of inhabitants like diarist Samuel Pepys. It was the wildly prolific authoress Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. Pepys mentions the Duchess repeatedly. Fantastically attired, travelling by silver coach, the huge retinue of servants, she cut such a dash that crowds followed her wherever she went. On a visit to Charles II's queen, Catherine of Braganza, to the now reopened theatres, and on an expedition to see experiments performed at the newly founded Royal Society. Pepys feverishly records his sightings of the Duchess, writing, for example, quote, "I met my Lady Newcastle going with her coaches and footmen all in velvet. All the town talk is nowadays of her extravagancies, with her velvet cap, her hair about her ears, many black patches, naked necked, and a black justau corps. She seemed to me a very comely woman. I hope to see more of her on May Day." Unquote. Elsewhere, he notes the eccentricity of her antic dress, and it concludes, quote, "Her whole life is a romance, and everything she do is romantic." Unquote. It is telling that Pepys characterized her, the devoted She-Cavalier, in this way. Margaret and her husband, the military commander William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, had suffered fortune's slings and arrows for the love of the Royalist cause. They had known defeat in the civil wars, and then the unthinkable, the execution of Charles I, followed by exile, the sequestration of their property, and privation. Such people might well have seemed quixotic to Pepys, who was more an earthy Sancho Panza than a dreaming Don Quixote. Pepys also had a knack for adapting to the changing political climate. But now that the monarchy had been restored, loyal types like the Newcastles could sweep back to center stage. Through figures like Margaret Cavendish, we can gain access to the Stuart court. How did this Baroque pearl among ladies take shape? All her life, Margaret Cavendish embraced singularity. She preferred to stand out from other women, even at the price of being mocked by both sexes. People began calling her Mad Madge. She disliked being copied, preferring to be seen as a curiosity among women, both in terms of appearance and intellect. Margaret, née Lucas, circa 1623, grew up the youngest of a large and loving Royalist family in Colchester. Margaret's father, Sir Thomas Lucas, had died when she was 2. The 8 Lucas children had a governess, an, quote, "ancient, decayed gentlewoman," unquote, and tutors. In her memoir, Margaret reports scribbling furiously from an early age, as well as designing her own fanciful garb. She describes herself as bashful with strangers, preferring to pursue, quote, "honest pleasures and harmless delights," unquote, with family. The Lucases loved one another's company, which was just as well since their neighbours were mostly parliamentarians. This private idyll would not last. Charles I had barely raised his standard, "give Caesar his due," when the Civil War came to their doorstep. A parliamentarian mob attacked their home, laying waste to the property and scattering the inhabitants. Margaret wrote of Royalist clans, quote, "This unnatural war came like a whirlwind, which fell down their houses, where some in the wars were crushed to death." Unquote. While the Lucas sons went off to fight in 1642, some of the women fled to Oxford, where Charles had made his headquarters since losing control of the capital. Charles's French queen, Henrietta Maria, established her court at Merton College in 1643. Distressed to learn that the queen now lacked sufficient ladies-in-waiting, the 19-year-old Margaret, quote, wooed and won my mother to let me go, unquote. She went to court as a maid of honor at the point when it was least likely to benefit her. No doubt it was this evidence of loyalty in trying times that won Margaret a place so close to the Queen. Margaret's time at court helps us understand how the retiring bookworm from the countryside eventually became the transformer who transfixed London society in the 1660s. As a maid of honor, Margaret would have been expected to take part in court entertainments, such as masques, allegorical narratives combining music, dance, and elaborate costumes and sets. It was quite a set of challenges for a homesick young woman, so shy with strangers that she could barely speak, convinced that people took her for a natural fool, as it was called. For Margaret's mistress, model, and inspiration, Queen Henrietta Maria, masks were a key part of life. In a way, the Queen owed her marriage to a mask. Charles I had first set eyes on Henrietta Maria when she appeared in one at the court of her father, King Henry IV of France. It was 1624, and the princess was 14. 1 year later, she and Charles, aged 23, were married in a proxy ceremony, meaning that she was already his wife when she arrived in England. The couple paraded down the Thames in a golden barge. Thomas Carlyle refers to this portrait when he describes her. Quote, a beautiful little creature she, if the Ritter Van Dyck lie not to us. Beautiful and sprightly, with her bright hazel eyes, their long white fingers, and dainty looks and ways, the daughter of the great French Henry, unquote. Henrietta Maria was chosen for the great alliance she brought. She also offered elegance, grandeur, and wealth for England's coffers. Because she was a Roman Catholic, however, the match was unpopular in many quarters. For Charles I, it was to be a source of profound blessings on the one hand, and considerable difficulties on the other. Henrietta Maria seemed to have been forged expressly to enrage the Puritans, those fiery Protestants who argued that the Reformation in England had not gone nearly far enough. Having fractured once in the 16th century, Western Christianity was now splintering on the Protestant side. Puritan is an umbrella term covering disparate groups. There was agreement on one thing, however. All were determined to rid the Anglican Church and the culture of any residual Catholic features. They faced strong opposition from the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. Meanwhile, actual Roman Catholics were facing severe punishments. Not only was Henrietta Maria a practicing Catholic with her own priests and an ornate chapel built by Inigo Jones, but she saw it as her role to intercede, taking the Virgin Mary as her model in the traditional manner of a Christian queen, with her husband on behalf of English Catholics. Henrietta Maria was the recusants mediatrix. Moreover, her fresh counter-Reformation aesthetic was attracting high-profile converts at court. Since the Council of Trent, convened from 1545 to 63 to address the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church across Europe had been playing to its strengths. The rejection of Calvin's doctrine of predestination in favor of free will was key. In response to Luther, the Church underscored the importance of both faith and works in the redemption of the human soul. Crucially, the act of receiving the Eucharist and other sacraments was essential. The centrality of the seven sacraments, Eucharist, baptism, confession, confirmation, marriage, holy orders, and anointing of the sick in Christian life, reaffirmed the priesthood. On the question of images, the Church averred that the Incarnation itself, the fact that God had taken flesh, made iconography more than permissible. It made it desirable and urgent. Church art, architecture, ceremony, liturgy, and music combined to bring the worshipper a powerfully emotional experience of the Eucharist, the meeting of heaven and earth. Today we know the aesthetic that powered Counter-Reformation renewal as the Baroque. The court that Margaret Lucas joined then was informed by this philosophy of beauty. Richness, glamour, dynamism, intensity, studies in contrast. Unsurprisingly, considering that the Baroque had originated in Rome, Puritans loathed it. The gulf between them and the Stuart court yawned ever wider. While the Puritans were iconoclasts, Charles, the head of the Anglican Church, was a confirmed aesthete. The painter Peter Paul Rubens considered him to be the greatest art lover of all the world's princes. Another observer claimed that Henrietta Mariah's taste was even more refined than her husband's. Her personal style, loose curls, ribbons, bows, voluminous satins, lace, and pearl drops, was widely copied. The king and queen were ardent patrons of the arts, bringing painters, sculptors, poets, dramatists, composers, architects, and landscape gardeners into their orbit. In 1632, one in a long series of culture clashes had occurred over a masque called the Shepherd's Paradise. Written by Walter Montague, it featured intricate sets and costumes by Caroline Court favorite Inigo Jones. Henrietta Maria and her ladies had innovative speaking roles, paving the way for England's first professional actresses, and further angering the peevish sects, as a Cavalier balladeer termed them in a song that runs like this, quote, that all peevish sects that would live uncontrolled and will not be governed as all subjects should, to New England may pack or live quiet in the old. We ask you to hear us, O Lord. Unquote. In 1633, Puritan pamphleteer William Prynne published a lengthy attack on the theatre entitled Histriomastics, the Player's Scourge or Actor's Tragedy. It denounced, among other things, the use of actresses. This was taken as a pointed reference to the Queen, though Prynne denied it. Archbishop William Laud had him imprisoned, shearing his ears for good measure. Prynne was later instrumental in Laud's fall and execution. Famously, when the Puritans took control of Parliament in 1642, one of their first acts was to shutter the theatres. The court that Margaret Lucas joined a year later was embattled. Its culture, its very existence, the very order it reified, was under threat. Margaret was impressed by what she found there. Demonstrating her loyalty to the Royalist cause once again, she accompanied Henrietta Maria into exile in France. They were welcomed by Louis XIV. In Paris, she met a prominent fellow exile, the Royalist commander William Cavendish, then Marquis of Newcastle. Newcastle had left England after the disaster of the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, having clashed over strategy with Charles I's swashbuckling cousin, Prince Rupert. Newcastle was beloved of his men as a courageous warrior of incredible refinement. After a battle, he would abandon himself to days of music and reading in his tent. Newcastle, a widower, was 30 years Margaret's senior, but they rapidly developed a close rapport. He had served as governor to Charles, Prince of Wales. A minor poet himself, Newcastle was also a great patron of the Cavalier school. Ben Jonson had dedicated various works to him. James Shirley had dedicated his play The Traitor to him, and William Davenant served as his aide in war. An expert horseman, the Marquis later authored a book on dressage. Margaret had found a virtuous man who would foster her literary pursuits, and encourage her flamboyant impulses. Someone who, quote, made me happy despite fortune's frowns, unquote. And Newcastle had found a helpmeet, kindred spirit, and biographer were perfectly complementary. Once the two had married, they moved to Antwerp, where the Prince of Wales had amassed his navy. In 1649, they were devastated by the news that his father, Charles I, had been executed at Whitehall. 5 days later, the Scottish Parliament proclaimed Charles II king. Newcastle then joined his Privy Council. Moving into Reuben's grand former residence, they formed the Newcastle Circle, a salon which included Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, and Pierre Gassendi. It was here that Margaret was first exposed to natural philosophy, the branch of learning that came to be known as science. Margaret enjoyed its speculative dimension. Among the more interesting works we can retrieve from the blizzard of writing that Cavendish produced over the years is the description of a new world called the Blazing World. Since the publication of More's Utopia, the penning of one's ideal commonwealth had become a parlor game popular among aristocrats. In her preface, the authoress plays upon the idea of fiction as infinite personal dominion, quote, "Though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I can be Margaret I, and although I have neither power, time, nor occasion to conquer the world as Alexander and Caesar did, yet rather than not be mistress of one, since fortune and the fates would give me none, I have made a world of my own, for which nobody, I hope, will blame me, since it is in everyone's power to do the like." Unquote. Her husband's dedicatory poem celebrates her ingenuity, quote, "But your creating fancy thought it fit to make your world of nothing but pure wit." Unquote. Kind of utopian romance or proto-science fiction, The Blazing World was published in 1666 as a companion piece to her Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. It is the story of a noble lady who discovers a parallel world attached to ours at the North Pole, like a bead on a necklace. It is populated by assorted nations of anthropomorphized beasts, bearmen, foxmen, and birdmen. They take her to their emperor, quote, "to whom they all submitted with the greatest duty and obedience, which made them live in the greatest peace and happiness, not acquainted with foreign wars and homebred insurrections." Unquote. Making her his wife, the emperor gives her absolute power. The authoress clearly relished creating a realm which conformed to her wishes. This inner world offered a haven from the stubborn disorder of the outer one. Modern-minded critics who wish to see their ideas everywhere in embryo have had difficulty stuffing the Duchess of Newcastle into the progressive mold. Yes, she wanted certain remarkable women like herself to enjoy fame. Margaret perceived that the Stuart culture could happily include certain accomplished females, and a good look at the example of Restoration theatre tells us that she was right. But she chiefly wanted recognition as a rarity, like an object in a cabinet of curiosity. Moreover, her concerns are entirely aristocratic in nature. She was by no means the first noble to display anxiety about publication. Many such poets had confined themselves to circulating their works in manuscript. Aristocrats were reluctant about selling their wares. This is one reason why she frequently insists on her bashfulness. Margaret Cavendish subscribed heartily to Charles I's understanding of the social order. As Mencius Moldbug reminds us, Charles argued that security and stability are the vital preconditions for liberty. As the king proclaimed on the executioner's block, quote, "For the people, and I truly desire their liberty and their freedom as much as whomsoever else. But I must tell you that their liberty and their freedom consists in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may most be their own." Unquote. Stuart courtiers, like the Duchess of Newcastle and her husband, braved misfortune to save an order wherein, they believed, virtue and delight could walk hand in hand. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and please do comment below.